So we are, as you know, we're on fact number 5, Jesus' tomb was empty, and thanks to Greg for subbing for me on Sunday. Are there any questions or anything left over from last time that you want to bring up? Something you're wondering about or maybe had additional questions on? And then we have to give a grade, so not really, I'm joking. Okay, well, thanks Greg for that. And so I watched the class, and you all had a very in-depth discussion. Of course, as happens every single time, not just when someone's subbing, when I'm up here too. Did not get as far as we wanted, but that's great because we have so much to say about all of this. So he talked about the introduction and really got into a lot of things that I think will help later in terms of the discussions with the Sanhedrin and the different considerations that they would have had at the time. And then just generally, why is the empty tomb important? What does that say about the nature of the resurrection as the apostles were proclaiming it, and so on. And so you discuss that, and I'm assuming there's nothing that anyone wants to bring up, as we already said. Okay, and so that'll bring us to the burial of Jesus in the empty tomb, which is on page 1, that first bolded heading. So what we're going to be starting with tonight is things that we've already gone over, and we'll be asking some questions sort of applying this information that we've already gone over. And so as a way to sort of apply what we had talked about previously, why is the burial of Jesus important when talking about the empty tomb? Why is the burial of Jesus important when talking about the empty tomb?
It shows that they believed him to be dead.
They believed him to be dead. Okay, so that's one thing, right?
If he never was put in a tomb, he couldn't raise from the tomb.
Yeah, if he didn't die and then his body wasn't put there, then there would be no resurrection. What else? Great.
It's important to the human nature of Christ, as far as understanding God as far as we can, which we're limited. It helps us know that there wasn't just some ethereal form that the apostles all wandered around the earth with. He was a physical man.
Yeah, he was really human. Absolutely. All right, we're saying a lot of good things. What else? Why is the burial important to the empty tomb? Did you have your hand up, Salem?
Knowing where he was buried, you'd be able to know if he was still buried or not.
Okay, yeah, if you knew where he was buried, then you would know if the body was missing, right? And I'm sure you got that from our conversations, because I was like, that sounds exactly like what I have in my notes. Well, that's fine. So yeah, we have all these things that points to the physicality or the humanity of Jesus, and the fact that he was actually dead. And again, if there's no body, there's no burial, then there's no raising from the grave, right? And also the fact of, if we know where the body is, then we're going to know if it's missing. And that's a lot of what we talked about with the burial of Jesus the first time. And so, as I said actually in this opening paragraph, it's important because if it's well known how Jesus was buried and where, and obviously when, then it would be easy to reliably establish that his body was missing. If this was all done publicly and people saw it, then there wouldn't really be much of a question about it. Andrew.
Scriptures also emphasize that it would prevent the body from being stolen.
Okay. Prevent the body from being stolen, right. And that was interesting as I was going back through tonight, what the chief priests were saying to Pilate in Matthew. And they said, let's put a guard here until the point when he said that he would rise from the dead, right? Just to make sure that somebody's not going to come and take this body. And so they understood, that there was this danger of that happening. And we'll maybe talk about a little bit of that more. Anything else that you can think about why reliably establishing the burial would be important for the empty tomb. Ellie.
I think because the prophecy was accomplished, since, it's like a relation with the Old Testament.
Yeah, so the prophecy of all of this is accomplished, right? And so that would confirm what the Old Testament says about it, of course. And that's what Jesus said he was doing. Everything that the prophets had spoken about, he was fulfilling, right? So all of this are different facets of that. And so let's look at some of these things that we talked about, and this was fact number 2. If at some point you're wanting to go back and say, where did we talk about that at? Fact number 2, where we looked at the death of Jesus and his burial in a little bit more detail. But I have here, 3 different things that we talked about that show that the burial of Jesus is reliable. And if the burial of Jesus is reliable, then we know where the body's at, and we would know if it was missing. I say we, including us in the story, right? Because we weren't there. And so one of the things that we mentioned was the different specific details about Jesus' burial showed that it was credible. Can you remember what sorts of details we talked about with the burial, what's said about the burial, and how those details made it more reliable, what was being told to us? Or showed that it was reliable is a better way to say that. What kind of details did we talk about?
Did we discuss about the lady coming in, putting spice on the body in the grave?
Well, that is one of the things of, right, it says the women were the ones who followed him to the tomb, prepared the body and all of those things. And as we talked about before, and we'll talk about more, nobody was going to invent the women as the primary witnesses and the actors in that. So the fact of saying that it was the women who went and did those things shows it's reliable. Margaret, do you ever?
And the fact that Joseph of Arimathea was a well-known man who asked for his body.
Right. So Joseph is another detail, and we'll get into more detail about that in this next section here. So there's a specific person involved, right? What else? One that I'm thinking of, a key word would be hour. That's your clue. The word hour. Oh, yeah. Homophones, that's a thing. H-O-U-R, that's what I'm thinking of. So it said multiple times of the blank hour and the blank hour and the blank hour, right? Does anybody know where I'm going? Do you remember?
It was dark.
It was dark. Okay, so it says Jesus was crucified at this hour. It was dark starting at this hour. Jesus died about this hour. And so there's this timeline that's given to us that shows, okay, there's a specific time when these things happen. And so if you do all of the historical work, you can know essentially the day and the hour when Jesus died. That's pretty specific. And then if we talk about what the Jews were concerned about of getting the body off of the cross, right? Because of what the law said, that they didn't want to defile the land in the way that they looked at it, of that their day ended and the next one began at sundown, about 6. And so they had this small window, right, of when Jesus needed to be taken off the cross and buried. So that's pretty specific. Anything else? What other details? What about Jesus' death in particular and what people thought about it? I think I had Andrew and then Chip. Do you have your hand up? No? Okay, then Chip.
I thought it was interesting when the centurion said this must have been a righteous man after the temple veil was torn in two. So that would be another eyewitness that wouldn't have been a follower of Christ that people could possibly reinvestigate, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. The centurion is watching. He says there was something special about him, looking at the way that he died. Yeah, and that's especially in Mark. Mark really makes that important as testimony of Jesus' divinity by that centurion there. So that's really important to the story. Any that we want to add?
I mean, we see that, it says in Luke 23:48, and all the crowds that assembled for the spectacle, when they saw this, what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. Basically, if you're asking what was the reaction of people, it seems like people were rejoicing everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there was the effect of this was something that people saw and witnessed and, experienced, and this was a big deal. And later in Luke, the two on the road to Emmaus say, are you the only person that hasn't heard about what just happened the last few days, right? What about Pilate's reaction to Jesus' death? He's surprised. Why is he surprised? Yeah, usually it would take longer. And if it was taking too long, right, then we know they would break the legs to hasten it. And so those are just details, different ones that we've talked about. All of those details that we've just mentioned. So Pilate's reaction, the hour, the reactions of people, different things like that. Joseph of Arimathea. Are those really like the main part of the story where the author is saying, hey, look at all this stuff, you got to believe me? Or do they state it a different way? That's probably not very clear, is it? No? Brace? Read my mind.
They're just expressed as details, not as really the focal point. I mean, they're essentially describing the events that happened. The focal point is that Jesus of Nazareth, the one they believed to be the Messiah, was executed. But all these other details are really just more a part of them describing the true event of what really happened.
Yeah, right. They're just telling the story. And you can tell that the way that the writers are telling the story, their main thing is not to prove that all of these things were true. They're just stating it. This is what happened. And so the details that we're talking about, the word that we've used is incidental. So they're just part of the story. So they get brought up just by telling what happened. And when you look at some of those details and how it kind of all puts this picture together of, oh, wow, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's reliable. And so those specific details about Jesus' burial, show the reliability of the accounts for those different reasons. One, that they're said incidentally, suggesting authors are just reporting what happened. They're not really trying to prove anything. They're just telling the story of Jesus. And another thing about details. So I think a good way to illustrate this, when your child is lying to you, do they tend to give you a really simple story, or do they tend to make it really complex and complicated and add things to it?
Well, when Rebecca told the neighbor about the horse, she gave the long details.
Yeah, right.
Very close. That story's like,
Okay, so why does a kid add a bunch of details to the story? Try to make it more believable. And usually a parent will think about those details and do what? You just say, oh yeah, that's okay. Cool. Or do you start looking at those details and seeing if they're true or not? Right? So a kid is trying to convince you that what they're saying is true, and so they make it more complex and they add all these things to it. That just somebody came in and grabbed my hand and put it in the cookie jar. All those kind of things. And adding details like that, it relates to what is called falsifiability. So when something is falsifiable, what does that mean?
Could be proven wrong.
Yeah, falsifiability is you can prove whether it's right or wrong. And so part of adding details to a story is it gives the opportunity to prove whether this is true or false. And so with a kid concocting a lie and putting all those details together, pretty soon you can see, all of these fantastical things that they tell us show that the story is false. It leads to the falsifiability. But when there are these incidental details in different things that can be proven true or false, and you see, okay, yeah, that's reliable. They're telling the truth about that. Even though that's not the main part of the story, does that increase our confidence in what they're telling us or decrease it? If you're starting to look at the details of someone's story and you see that they're true, does that make you more confident in what they're saying?
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we're talking about with these details of Jesus' burial. And not just the burial, but the rest of the story too. That they're giving us these details, and they're not doing it in the way that a kid lies to his parents, right? They're just saying it straightforwardly, and it relates to the falsifiability of the story. So the details are either true or untrue. Okay. Now, if there's nothing else on that, let's look at Joseph of Arimathea. Yeah, Wish.
I was just gonna say something that's really common in like detective work is when there's small nuanced information that's true, but it doesn't always match 100% what everyone else said. And like you can see that sometimes in the different gospels and how they all share something different. It's not a script.
Right.
And so that just helps even more solidify the natural tendencies of true storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you watch cop shows or you even watch true crime, right? And they bring all of these different witnesses in. What's usually the investigator's reaction when everyone's telling the same exact story word for word? This is a little suspicious, right? How are you guys getting the same exact wording all the way down? And so we see, the Gospels, they're not seeming to follow a script. We can see that they do seem to be using similar sources in a lot of them and sharing information. But they state it in a way that it gives a different shadow to the story, or it expresses a detail and things like that. So that's a good point. Thank you. Okay, so Joseph of Arimathea. We talked about specific details that show that the burial is reliable. Joseph of Arimathea. And so we're told in all of the Gospels that this is who buried Jesus, right? And what we talked about with that is the fact that these records mention a specific prominent person argues that the accounts of Joseph burying Jesus are reliable. Why? Why does naming a specific person show that the story about Jesus' burial is reliable? Brace.
If I'm Joseph of Arimathea, and this story is being propagated, and it's a lie, you can bet I'm going to come forward and say, this is a lie.
Yeah.
I know that because I'm him, I am he, and I did not have anything to do with this burial.
Right, and he would have things to lose about that, true. And so, if the Christians are saying Joseph buried Jesus and he did not, he's probably going to say something about that, someone of his standing. What about if Joseph didn't exist? Right? So, say, the gospel writers, they write this, Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus, and then the Jews in that area are saying, who's Joseph of Arimathea?
But he was the person known to them.
Exactly, right?
And he was apparently sympathetic to the Christian cause.
Right. And so there were people that knew him, and it shows the fact that the Christians are not making this guy up. People knew him. There was details about him, all of those things that show that he wasn't a fabrication to the story, right? Because if he was, then that could be easily proved. Okay, so a question about that with Joseph. So what details are we given about Joseph of Arimathea? Let's kind of list those out. So we talked about how this is a specific person. What details are we given? Chip?
Am I correct to assume that where it says a city, Arimathea is a city, that means it's not a village, so it's a more populated place than just like a village? Would that be why they say like of Arimathea, because it's like a well-known city in a way?
Yeah, so I've seen discussions about how big it was, but right, we're given the detail Joseph is from Arimathea, which was in the same region. It was in Judea. And so they give the detail of, for one, his name's Joseph, and this is where he's from. And again, it's a known place. What else are we given about Joseph?
He's on the Jewish council.
He's on the council, right. So we're given his name, we're given his hometown, we're given his place on the Jewish council.
It says he was a good and righteous man.
He was a good man, so he had a good reputation. People knew about him.
He was a prominent member of the council.
Right.
He wasn't just a council member.
Yeah, he didn't just squeak by in getting in there, but he was a prominent person. Anything else? Yeah, he was a man of means. And so the tomb argues about that and different things about the story. And keep in mind, with their tombs, and so after this sheet is over, I plan on going through and we'll look at some pictures of these tombs so that we can see this and put the story together. But when we say a hewn tomb, someone had to go in there and dig that out. And they didn't have a pneumatic hammer to do that, right? And so people had to go in there by hand with a hammer and a chisel and dig this thing out. Does that cost a lot, do you think? To have a bunch of people dig a hole out of rocks? Yeah, it does. And so Joseph is also a man of means. So we're given his name, his hometown, that he's a standing member of the council. I think we said this earlier, but that he's sympathetic to Jesus, that he was wealthy, and also the location of the burial in his personal tomb, which would not have been a private thing, right? It would have been, this is the tomb of the family of Joseph of Arimathea, right? Chip?
Did you mention it was newly hewn, like it hadn't had a body in it yet?
Right.
So
That's another detail.
it would be very hard for it to have like overgrowth to it and stuff in the near future. So it'd be something that for like the next 4 years, there'd be no mistake of that was the tomb that is in question, because like all the fresh rock would still be there. You would be able to see there wouldn't be like moss over it, things like that.
Yeah, I don't think I had really thought about that before. That's a good point. This wasn't something that would be easily missed, right? Yeah.
Little details like that, I know.
And with what I was talking about, after this packet, I do want to show you guys a tomb that they have found and excavated that gives a lot of good detail. And it's exactly that. It was overgrown, and so somebody found it in the 20th century just by accident, and they didn't know it was there. But not the case with Joseph's, of being new and prominent and all of those things. It would be a location that people would know about. So why do those details, so we're not just talking about the burial now, let's make a jump here. Why do those details about Joseph lend support to the truth of the empty tomb? Why do the details about Joseph give support to the truth about the empty tomb? This is not on your paper. This is putting what we're talking about into action here. Any guesses? Why would the details about Joseph support the truth of the empty tomb? Andrew, did you put your hand up?
Well, I was going to say that the handling of Jesus' body was pretty extensive, and Jesus wasn't just swept away, or his body wasn't just disposed of by the Romans or the Jews in an obscure kind of way. So it was well known. They handled the body, they transported the body, they tended to the body to prepare it for burial. So there was a lot of interaction prior to laying Jesus to rest. So all of those details of the tomb match with the level of care that was shown to Jesus by the people who wanted to honor him after his burial. Some of whom weren't necessarily his disciples, but were converts or convinced of wanting to do this to show honor to Jesus.
Okay. Yeah, so you have those kind of details there of all of the things that were done in care of Jesus. And yeah, that would have Again, that's bringing a lot of people into the story, right? Of saying, okay, they were sympathetic and they did all of these things for him in his burial. Greg?
The account in Mark 15 talks about Joseph of Arimathea, can't say it, Joseph of Arimathea gathering his courage to go to Pilate to ask for the body.
Yeah.
And we had a little bit of speculation is this may have been the very first time that Joseph made a public display of his affinity for Christ. Members of the council may not have known up to this point. They may have wondered, or I don't know if they ever had a show of hands or a meeting when they say, let's kill him. Who's with me? Did Joseph of Arimathea sneak to the back of the room so he didn't have to raise his hand? I have no idea. But he either gathered courage because he was outing himself as a Christian, or he was gathering courage because he was going before Pilate. And
Either way.
Sure how that was going to turn out.
Right.
This is a man who's got the thumb up and the thumb down for death, and so either of those, when you talk about the characteristics that we've seen so far, that's a pretty bold move to go to Pilate.
Yeah.
And ask for the body.
Yeah, that brings up a lot of what I want to talk about. So, Joseph going to Pilate, would that have been a public move? Do you think he could have snuck into Pilate and asked for the body and got the body and buried it and no one found out about it?
I don't think so.
No. When you're looking at the story, we can see, again, details that show that. You know, he goes to Pilate, probably other people in the room, right? If he's sitting on, the tribunal. Do you think when one of the prominent Jews asked for the body of Jesus to go in his personal tomb, that would have stayed quiet? I'm thinking of servants and other people that would have been hearing about it. And then when Joseph gets the body and has to take it to the tomb, is he carrying it on his own? Keep in mind the short window of time to get him in the tomb, right? So there's other people there. And I would argue to say to get the linen cloth and to get all of the spices for embalmment and to transport the body and all those things, it assumes that other people are involved. Do you think, again, it would have been a secret that Jesus was in Joseph's tomb? No. I mean, that everyone would know that that's Joseph's tomb, right? And then on Saturday, the Sanhedrin says, hey, Pilate, can you send some guards to the tomb so that people don't try to steal the body? So did they know where the tomb was and where Jesus was? So it wasn't a secret. So all of these things, the details about Joseph, they support the truth of the empty tomb because, for one, as we said, it attaches the story to a particular person that we have details about. And so that is, again, falsifiable. You can show that it's true or you can show that it's untrue. Because, again, if he wasn't a real person, we could prove that. And also Joseph, receiving the body of Jesus, putting it in his own tomb, would presumably have been public knowledge, at least to the Sanhedrin. And that is, I think, strongly because in Matthew chapter 27, you see they know where Joseph's tomb is. They know that Jesus is in the tomb, and that's why they want guards to go there. And so is it probably then reliable if everybody knows about it, that this is what happened? Yeah. Andrew and then Ellie.
I'm going to ask a question. If the location of Joseph's tomb would have been so well known and so verifiable, why has it fallen into relative obscurity where for sure Jesus' tomb was now? I know that there's the Church of the Holy
Sepulcher, I think.
I don't know how to say that word. That is kind of a traditional shrine church that's been built at a location, but there's not a unanimous consensus of where that location was.
Right. So the question is basically, you state that question again.
If it was
Sum it up for
If
me.
it was so well known where Joseph's tomb was, why is it not agreed upon where Jesus' tomb was today?
Okay, that's what I thought you were saying, but I could not pull the words out. So right, there's a couple, traditional options. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is said to have been built over the tomb. There's the tourist spot of the garden tomb that you can go to, and pretty much everyone's like, yeah, that's probably not the spot. So I want to open it up to you first. Why do you think maybe we don't know where the tomb is? What are some reasons as to either that being lost to history or maybe people not caring about where the tomb is either? Great, or I don't know who had their hand up first. Rock, paper, scissors. I'll give it to Emily.
I think one thing could be part of God's hand because he's, a God who's a living God and a God who's against idols. And I think part of the reason why we might not know where it is because if we did, more people would worship it. And then the other side of it is just kind of like, yes, back then everyone knew where it was, but at the end of the day, it was just a tomb, so it wasn't like built in grandeur, like a palace or something that like was supposed to withstand. So I think it could have just been lost in time because it's just a tomb. Like it wasn't something that was built to withstand and be this monument of anything.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things there in what you said. So there's what we could say is maybe a theological reason of if the tomb was venerated, that could be a problem for a lot of people, right? And then also the fact of if someone remained in their tomb, they were spots for people to go to and venerate and sometimes worship, right? So Jewish martyrs, David, the tombs of the kings, all of those things that in the New Testament area still existed. And they said, for instance, as you talked about in Acts 2, we know where David is buried because his tomb is still here and we can go visit it, right? But if there's no body there, it's just a hole in the ground, right? Because the point is not the tomb as much as the one who came out of it. And so that's one thing. What else? Chip, you had your hand up.
My guess is that Joseph's family ended up starting to use it afterwards. I mean, they didn't
Yeah, I don't know.
make a new one, I would assume.
So that would be interesting because according to the law, they would not be really allowed to use it anymore because it would have been defiled by a body. But also it was Jesus. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if anywhere it says that they continue to use the tomb or not.
I mean, to Chip's point, it was Roman tradition to reuse burial sites pretty frequently. And so if at some point the land got out of their control, we know that the Jews were displaced from Palestine again when Jerusalem fell years later. So the land was occupied by other people who wouldn't have respected those traditions.
Yeah.
I think it is quite likely that the area was repurposed.
Yeah, and that was another question I was going to ask. So in Acts chapter 2, Peter points to David's tomb. They're probably not right next to it, right? But he says, it's over there. Why don't we know where it is now? I mean, they knew where it was. Why don't we know where it is?
The important thing was about the tomb was that people knew where it was then, and then that's recorded, and we have the fact that it was recorded. So it was important that they know then where the tomb was, where Jesus was buried, because that makes the death and burial and resurrection believable and provable.
Okay, yeah.
As
And
far as today, there are people who make shrines out of things like that, and we're just commanded to not worship that sort of thing. And, it could be a point, and there are things that they say, well, this is a certain thing, this is a certain thing, and people go to worship that. So they're worshiping the wrong thing.
yeah, so there's a lot in that, absolutely. Greg, what were you going to say?
There's more time passed where Jerusalem and Judea is not in Jewish hands control in the last 4,000 years and the times that it has been in their control. The Romans may have, repurposed, but there was the whole Muslim movement that took Jerusalem. There were Turkish Empire interest in the area. It's been run over so many times. It's the same reason that
Yeah, you gonna piggyback off that, Bruce?
No, I was just gonna say, I'm not sure how significant an empty tomb would be in the grand scheme of things. I mean, as a believer myself, I believe firmly in the testimony of the witnesses. I don't need the tomb. If I was a skeptic, I'm not gonna believe because you present me an empty tomb. I could come up with all kinds of explanations for how the tomb was empty, ranging from it wasn't the tomb he was buried in to someone did steal the body. I mean, I could come up with anything. So I'm just not sure how significant a piece of evidence an empty tomb is going to be in the grand scheme of things for either side.
I think a lot of that goes to sort of what Emily was talking about. And with what Greg is discussing, so you have, right, the Ottomans come in, you know, the Turks, all kinds of people. A few years after this, Jerusalem gets completely obliterated. And so that's a lot of the reason that we don't have a lot of this stuff anymore either, is because it was destroyed. And tagging onto that is a pretty common practice was grave looting. And so most of the tombs that they find, grave robbers have already gotten to them. And so they're destroyed and there's nothing there anymore. And so really going back to Andrew's question, I think it's a conglomeration of a lot of reasons. For one, a lot of those things were destroyed. Two, the tombs themselves weren't really the point. There's the theological reasons about it. Brace.
I just want to clarify something. It was highly significant that the tomb was empty when the witnesses were
Yeah.
It's not significant today is my point. So,
Right.
Yes, it was highly significant then, but it has a lot less relevance in my mind the further we get away from the event.
Right. It's significant for their witness, but as they talked about in class on Sunday, the fact of the empty tomb is not really what's controversial because there could be all kinds of reasons that the body is gone. It's the explanation for why it's empty. Was it stolen by somebody? Did they lose it? Or did the body walk out, right? Okay, and then Ellie, before we went on Andrew's question, you said something. Do you remember what you're going to say?
Some points about Joseph, and one regarding the tomb is that once again he helped to fulfill the prophecy. In Isaiah 53:9 says that the suffering of the so it's all about the Old Testament matching perfectly in the new one, and also because Joseph was a secret disciple of Jesus, and he was Jewish, so it's supposed, not to follow Jesus. So it's perfectly matching everything, and that's why he requests the Jesus body.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like a declaration of his faith.
Yeah, all of that kind of stuff is so interesting that people are just doing their thing and it so happens to fall within God's plan and happens exactly the way it was supposed to, even though, they're just exercising their own choice, and Joseph is getting the body and therefore fulfills Isaiah, and it's just all of those kinds of things that are really interesting. Okay, so right, with Joseph of Arimathea, all of those details show that this is really something significant. And the fact that it's painted in such a reliable picture shows, okay, yeah, the tomb must have been empty. So I want to look at this last one here, which is at the top of page 2. Jesus' burial is consistent with ancient Jewish burial practices. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about this. But it's just basically to say, if we were reading the story about Jesus and how he died and how he was buried, and it was wildly different than any other situation that you could read about around the time, would that be suspicious? If Jesus' burial was totally different than everyone else, that would be pretty suspicious. But it's not, and that's kind of the thing. It's consistent with what is going on. And so one of the ways that I want you to think about that is, who did the nation of Israel think Jesus was when he was crucified? What was their opinion of Jesus when he was crucified? Salem gave a thumbs down, but I want you to be a little more specific than that. What did the Jews think about who Jesus was at the time? Accursed of God. even more generally, a messianic pretender, right? All of those kinds of things. Had those sort of people come around before? Yes, and there were more after Jesus. And so if Jesus was treated differently than all of those other people that were seen as messianic pretenders, that would be weird. Because from their perspective, he was just like the rest of them. And so it makes sense that he was treated in the same way, of course, with the exception of some of his disciples. And so that's just one thing I want you to think about. We can talk about that more later, but let's look at number 1 there on page 2, unless someone's got something to bring up. Okay, so number 1. If the disciples in the Sanhedrin knew how and where Jesus was buried, would it be likely that the disciples would forget where Jesus' tomb was, or that his body would somehow be misplaced? So this is putting together what we've just talked about with the burial, and saying if everybody knew about this, where it was, how it was buried, is it likely that the disciples would have gone to the wrong tomb, or that somehow the body would have been lost? No. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of heads shake no. It wouldn't make any sense, right? The Sanhedrin knew where it was. The disciples knew where it was. The people who would have witnessed this, I'm sure that it wasn't just, the servants of Joseph of Arimathea witnessing these things. Again, you're walking through the cemetery and the guards are standing there. This was public. So to argue that somehow people would forget and they just went to the wrong tomb and it happened to be empty, or the fact that the body was lost or something, that doesn't take seriously the core details of what the story is telling us, right? What did we say about that one, number 1? Anything that you saw that you want to add? Andrew.
Not just the people involved, but as soon as one person gets it wrong and tells other people, everyone after them also makes the same mistake and gets it wrong. I mean, there had to be.
Yeah.
At some point, you get to someone who goes, guys, here's the tomb right here.
Yeah, you morons, it's right over.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the important things too, of if the disciples went to the wrong tomb or thought they lost the body, and the Jews are saying, he's right here. Like, everybody just stop this mess now. The body is still in here. Christianity would have been done. But that's not what happened. And so what we're going to talk about starting on Sunday then is the factors that point to the empty tomb, in addition to what we're discussing. So factors that point to the tomb being empty. So we'll talk about these. Be prepared to go through, I would say, at least page 3. We will try, but we'll see. Any questions or anything that needs to be brought up before we close?
This all shows that God's in control. God had predicted that it would happen this way, and it did.
I mean, yeah, that's really one of the core things about the class is if Jesus was raised from the dead, God did it. He's the only one that can. Okay, thank you, everyone.